Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Fanizadeh, and I'm coordinator at the VIDC, the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation. I'm responsible for migration and development in our institute and have a regional focus on the Middle East. I would like to welcome you to today's discussion, Climate Crisis Boosts Displacement. And I also welcome all the viewers on Facebook. We stream live, and I guess we have hundreds of viewers on our Facebook channel. I'm extremely happy to welcome our distinguished guests, Adil Najam, Raya Muttarak, and Jane Linekar. Welcome and thank you for being with us tonight. Today's event will be moderated by Daniela Paredes Grijalva, who will be also briefly introduce our speakers later on. Welcome, Daniela. And thank you for moderating for us today. Daniela Paredes Grijalva is a fellow and a researcher at the Institute for Social Anthropology of the Austrian Academy of Science. For her PhD project at the University of Vienna, she investigates how immobilities relate to environmental change in Indonesia. She has previously worked on transnational migration, gender, social protection as a researcher and practitioner. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to my colleagues at VIDC who have been very active in helping me to organize and carry out today's event, especially Irene Hochauer-Poda and Lisa Buchsch. A special thanks goes also to the Austrian Development Agency, the Austrian Development Corporation, which financed today's event, and IIASA for the excellent cooperation. Thank you, Monika Bauer. And thank you, the Hauptbücherei Wien, like always, for the very good cooperation. As mentioned before, today's talk and discussion will be held in English and translated simultaneously. So if you need translation into German, please take your headphones now. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event will explore how the climate crisis affects conflicts and displacement in the global south. And the background for today's event is quite clear. At the moment, the COP26 is taking place in Glasgow under the motto, Uniting the World to Tackle Climate Change. We have all heard about the conference and we hope for a positive outcome, but we are also very skeptical. So far, to quote Greta, blah, 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 no results at the COP26. What an unsatisfactory end to the conference means for the countries of the global south is what we want to discuss this evening. This is because people in the countries of the global south are particularly affected by the short-term and long-term impacts of climate change. They are less able to protect themselves from frequent and more intense weather-related events such as floods, fires, droughts, and storms, and are increasingly forced to leave their places of origin. To cite a few numbers, at the end of 2020, there were 55 million internally displaced people worldwide, 48 million of them as a result of conflict and violence, and 7 million as a result of environmental disasters. These are figures from UNHCR and IOM, whereby conflicts and climate crisis often go hand in hand and reinforce each other. At this point, I would like to end with my introduction and point out that there are feedback sheets on your seats that we ask you to fill out at the end of the panel discussion. On Facebook, you will find the link to the feedback formula in the comments. I wish us all an interesting evening, and I hand over now to Daniela Paredes Grijalva. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, okay. Herzlich willkommen auch meinerseits. Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on when you are tuning in, because this is a hybrid event. We are very happy to have so many of you here at the main library in Vienna, and we know there are many of you out there. We don't know where you're tuning in from, so a warm welcome to you all. A warm welcome also to our distinguished guests today at the podium. Very happy that you could join us again in the middle of a pandemic. We were speaking earlier on that it's wonderful to see you in person. It's still strange. We don't see our viewers on Facebook, but we know you're out there. We'll do our best to accommodate that. Later on, we will have an open section for questions. We will take questions from the audience here. And if you want to, if you're tuning in through Facebook Live, make sure to write your answer in the comments, and the VIDC team is keeping an eye on that and will flag those questions. So even if you're not here, you can engage and let us know your questions, your thoughts, your concerns, your food for thought. So as Michael said, the title today, the topic that invites us today is Climate Crisis Boosts Displacement, very timely, along with COP26, for good and for bad. We will discuss and hear more from all of you, perhaps on that front too. I'll briefly introduce our guests today. To my right, Adil Najam, an environmental and development researcher and expert in the field of climate change. He's professor of global public policy and environment and dean of the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Previously, he was the vice chancellor of the Lahore University in Pakistan, and in 2008, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed him to the UN Committee on Development Policy. He was also one of the co-authors for the third and fourth assessments of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a mouthful. In this work, the team was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for this work. Thank you for joining us and having crossed the oceans to meet us today. On my left, Raya Muttarak is Director of the Program of Population and Just Societies and Acting Research Group Leader of the Migration and Sustainable Development Research Group at IIASA, at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis here in Austria, a local, and Director of Population, Environment and Sustainable Development at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. Her research focuses on the reciprocal relationship between population and the environment, and her current projects include differential impacts of climate, variability on human health, migration and child welfare, climate change attitudes and environmental behaviors, and modeling and forecasting future vulnerability and adaptive capacity. Thank you for joining us also. And to my right, Jane Linekar, from the For Me, I asked you earlier, and I'm 4MI, right, it was very poetic. She is the global coordinator of 4MI, a leading project, a new project from the Mixed Migration Center based in Geneva. And she's leading this project that's looking into climate and mobility in Africa across 7 different countries. She's been previously a researcher and managing editor at Geneva's Graduate Institute of International Development Studies, and analysis team coordinator at ECAPS. She's worked also with a number of other international NGOs and think tanks. So that's a brief intro to all your trajectories. It doesn't do justice to everything you've been working on, and neither on this specific topic, this nexus of environment and migration, but we look forward to getting to know each of you a little bit better through your presentations and through the points you make. So without further ado, we are going to hear now from our keynote speaker, Adil Najam, on thinking climate and displacement. The floor is yours, Adil.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. Thank you for having me here, and it's wonderful to be with a wonderful and distinguished panel. If I could ask our colleagues to put my slides up there. Thank you so much. Technology is a wonder, and it's really wonderful to see actual people and to know that people do exist, sometimes sit on chairs rather than on little boxes in a Zoom video. But my greetings also to those who are on Facebook. So let me start by putting a few thoughts on this idea of where climate and displacement or migration or movement meet. And I'm grateful for the introduction, but the only word I would add to that is that I come to this question much more from the development side, at least in the beginning, and yet I have now made a career looking at climate and how it impacts development in general, developing countries in particular, and the poorest and most vulnerable populations in particular. Thank you so much. See, so that is what I'm going to do. I hope people can see my slides both on Facebook and here, because they look much nicer than I do. And what I want to do in the next 15 minutes, is ask 3 questions. I promise not to answer any of these questions, because they are not the type of questions that can be answered easily, but they're the type of questions that we should think about again and again. And the first of those questions is, how should we think about displacement and climate change? And I ask that question because there's an obvious, simple, immediate way to think about it, which I'm going to propose is not enough. So how should we conceptualize displacement and climate change? And I'll give you a little teaser on that before I go into it, which is that climate, I would argue, has historically always been a principal, if not the principal, reason for movement. There's a reason why birds move from Vienna to other parts when the winter comes. There's a reason why humans walked out of Africa. There's a reason why humanoids are now found on various continents in different ways. Historically, amongst the principal reasons for movement of species, including our own species, has been climate, including especially climate disasters, including especially drastic climate change. That is not new. What is new is that this time we are manufacturing that. And while we are used to now thinking of displacement because of war and natural disaster and so on and so forth, all of which is important, those are relative newcomers to the really big movements of people. Now, I'm not suggesting climate will do that, but I am suggesting that we might want to think earlier about trying to make that link. So I hope I've gotten your attention there, because I want to move to the second question, which is, what does it mean to live in what I have been calling for the last 5 or 6 years, the age of adaptation? And the essential argument I will make in a few minutes is that climate is no longer a future issue. We lie to ourselves. We are all lying to ourselves in COP26, where I was supposed to be right now, when we talk about it as if it is a future problem to be averted. By my back of the envelope calculation, for about 1 billion people in the world today, 1 billion, climate is an issue of today. Right now, right here. That's about the population that is facing, and therefore for them, the age of adaptation is not something that will come. The age of adaptation, other than mitigation, is here. Third question I want to ask, so what does it mean to be that? And the third question I want to ask in these few minutes is, how do migration challenges, how does migration challenge climate thinking? How does the idea of migration into the debate challenge those of us like myself who've been working on climate? And how does it force us to rethink how we think of climate, and vice versa? I know I'm amongst migration experts here. I would argue that there is also a need for those who study displacement to rethink what that means, including when you can't move. right? When we think of displacement, for example, we think of the person who moved. But what of the person who didn't move? Because the one who moves is very often the one who has the ability to move. They are more entrepreneurial, they're more young, they have resources, they have networks. So they find a way to go out. But what about those who cannot? Who are very often the most vulnerable. And therefore, climate, because of its nature, forces us to think of those. So those are three questions that I want to highlight. I want to rush through my slides because I do have a number of things I want to share, but I also want to respect time. I want to do this by essentially telling you a story. I'm sorry, if you were expecting something more profound, you won't get it. I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about insecurity. And I want to do so in one framework, 5 failures and a crisis that is waiting to be averted, I hope. And that's what I want to do, and I want to do it by looking at climate change as if justice mattered in an unequal world. I want to start with a little bit of science. I'll rush through this because this is a wonderful audience, and you probably know everything I'm going to say here about the basic science. But I want to make the point about the age of adaptation and what I mean by that. We've all heard of Paris, and we talk about Paris as this great success. It might have been, but at least as we sit today on the eve of COP26, I'm a creature of the COP. I was at every COP from the first one until Copenhagen. And then I gave up, realizing that my carbon cost of being there was higher than anything we were achieving by being there. I apologize for my cynicism, but I'm still a friend. I want these things to succeed. I want these things to succeed, but I'm not sure they're designed to. But let me give you the 2 big numbers that came out of Paris, right? The supposed thing we were all celebrating. They're essentially 2 numbers, which are both going to die in Glasgow. They've essentially been killed already by you and me, not just by governments, by you and me. The first number that you heard was 100 billion. 100 billion used to look like a very big number until COVID came along. Then we realized that we can print 1 trillion in a week. We can spend 1 trillion in a week. Doesn't even make a difference. But the big number that came out of Paris was 100 billion per year for developing countries' adaptation by 2021. Ain't happening. So if you've read the newspapers the last week, that's the number that was in contention. I don't think anyone in any developing country ever believed this was true. We smile when you make those promises. Thank you. We understand you're being polite. We understand no one really wants to keep these promises, but that's how they were made. So we'll give you that. The other number is more important because the other number is existential. And that number was between 1.5 and 2. Right? My colleagues at IIASA have done much more work than myself on this. I've been working on this with the IPCC and others. Here is the news. You know this already. Let me repeat it. There is no way at this point scientifically that 1.5 is going to be met. That is a triumph of hope over experience. There's just no way. I hope I'm wrong. I will give anything in the world to be wrong on this. But that's just the way the science is. Now the question is whether 2 can be met or not, keeping global temperature rise to 2. It is very unlikely. 1.5 is impossible. 2 is extremely unlikely. Now you might be saying, okay, that may be fine, but what's the difference between 1.5 and 2, right? The temperature in Vienna changed more than half a degree between this morning and today. And I want to talk about what that 0.5 degree means. But before that, you're all wearing masks and it's wonderful to see real people, but we all talk about 2020 was a special year. It was a year like no other, right? We went through COVID. Well, it was a year like no other in another way. Let me remind you what 2020 was like. 2020 started in January, and in January of 2020, we recorded the hottest January ever recorded. February, second hottest February ever recorded. While we were busy in COVID, the climate was not taking much issue with that. March, second hottest March ever recorded. April, second hottest ever. May, hottest May ever. By June, hottest ever. By June, people weren't even talking about this. This had become a monthly news. Second hottest July ever. Second hottest August ever. Hottest September ever. Third hottest October ever. November, hottest ever. This is what I mean, that this is not a future issue. This is not about something that will happen. This is something that does happen. December, they gave us a little respite, 8th. I can go to 2021, but we don't have time, except to remind you that July of this year was the hottest month ever recorded, ever, since recordings began. The point I'm trying to make is my age of adaptation. That's the age of adaptation. This is not a future issue. Now, let me put the same data. I hope people can see the screen. This is the same data. This is not about the future. This is actual recorded data for every month ever since we've been recording data. 1915, 1926, 1938, 44, 55, 65, 76, 87, 95, keeps going. That's the 1.5 line. I stop at 2016. It keeps going on. That's actual data. I have stopped in protest to put any graph up that is in the future. Because by talking about climate as a future issue, we fool ourselves into thinking we have time. This is real data for real people whose real livelihoods depend on this. Now, you might be saying, I don't live on the planet, Professor. I live in Vienna. Tell me about myself. Same data for every point on Earth for which we have data, ever since we started collecting actual temperatures. So you see the same thing. Choose whatever part of the world you are interested in. This is actual recorded data. This is not what may or may not happen. This is what we know has been happening, 1975, 1979. Right? So the point I'm trying to make with these two graphs is, let us stop talking about this as a future issue. This is the current issue. And therefore, the question is, what does it mean if this is so? And that brings us back to this idea of 1.5, right? What is half a degree between friends? What does it mean if it's 2 rather than 1.5? I had a press interview this morning, and the lady who was interviewing me wonderfully asked, what's the difference in 0.5? I'll tell you what the difference between 0.5 is. There is a bunch of people up to about 2.5 billion for whom it could mean existence. There's a bunch of people, about 2.5 billion, I don't think any of them are in this room, I'm not in that group, for whom their livelihoods do not continue if we break 1.5. There are countries that may or may not survive that. What does that mean? Again, one of the IPCC report, extreme heat doubles. From a 14% rise in extreme heat at 2 degrees, at 1.5, it's 37. Sea ice, free Arctic, increases 10 times, because we're talking global temperature here. Sea level rise by 0.6 meters difference. The coral reefs, 30% more loss of global coral reefs, right? And so on and so forth. I'm rushing through this, but this is what happens with what seems like an everyday change. Because the change, when it happens globally, is the entire system. And that is what brings us to what I'm calling the age of adaptation. So what does the age of adaptation look like? Right? Why are we interested, and how does this link to displacement? What happens? Right? What changes? The biggest thing that changes in the age of adaptation, and I'll come to this picture in a minute, the biggest thing that changes in the age of adaptation is that in the age of adaptation, you are no longer talking carbon. You're talking impacts, right? When we talk about mitigation, you say bring emissions down because you want to stop the problem. In the age of adaptation, you're saying, okay, what happens because of that? And the first and biggest one is nature, ecosystems, right? Now, I used to serve on the board of WWF, and we were very fond of putting those pictures of, a slab of ice and a polar bear on it. And I would tell my colleagues, that's the wrong picture, because that picture makes you think as if the polar bear is waiting for you to come and help it. Right? It makes the polar bear sort of in the middle of the ocean as if they're sending an SOS to humans, please come and save us. I have spoken to a few polar bears. They have no faith in me. They have no faith in you. They are not waiting for us. That is not how they work, because our track record is not good. Nature, when you hit it, hits back. And that is why this picture is better. In fact, the even better picture is this. That's what happens at 1.5. That's the dengue mosquito. What makes people move is not the polar bear in the middle of the ocean. What makes people move is dengue moving all across South Asia right now to places where it shouldn't be. There is no reason why dengue should be found on the foot of the Himalayas. Now, I'm not suggesting it's happening because of climate change only. It's also happening because of human movement and travel. But species, disease vectors, adapt to climate much faster than us. And therefore, you start finding disease where you are not supposed to. The most important or the most likely impacts are all going to be about water. They're already about water. Right? When we talk about climate emissions, we are talking about carbon, and that's why we're talking about energy. When you talk about impacts, most of them are wet. What happens when climate changes? Water rises, sea level rise. Water melts, glaciers. Water disappears, drought. Water falls from the sky like no one's business, floods. So a lot of the impacts you are seeing already in your headlines are about water. The future of climate policy is going to be as much about water as it is about energy today. And to give you an example, that's all the fresh water there is in the world, to scale. That, by the way, is a lot of fresh water. There's no dearth of fresh water. It's a question of access. But to give you a sense of what that means, the picture you see is from my country in Pakistan in the 2010 floods. We've been in a state of flood every year since then. When the floods happened, I took this map. We were trying to raise support for it, and I was finding it difficult to explain to people what a flood means. So that blue area is the area in which the floods happened, right? So look at that squiggle. I put that on an actual map of the US, and that's what it takes up, from one end to the other. I put it on an actual map of Japan. That's what a flood means. I put it on an actual map of Europe, up from Denmark to France. Right? So now when you think about floods and livelihoods, that's the type of impact that happens. That means if you are in agriculture, if you are in anything, your life is being displaced. As soon as you talk water, you're talking about impacts on food. Because what is food except nature's way of packaging water? Right? So that we can transport it. I'm joking, but only half joking. Right? As soon as the water system changes, the food system changes. Food system changes, the livelihood of up to 3.5 billion people change. That's the movement. That's the push. It's not disasters only. Yes, disasters too. If I can't grow what I was growing, that's the push that's also coming to move me from what I was doing. Energy I won't go into, except we talk about energy as if the solution is everyone uses less energy. That's not the solution. For 4 billion people in the world, they need to use more energy because there is energy poverty. The question is whether they can leapfrog past the fossil fuel energy that we've been using to greener ones, right? And that becomes the displacement. I'm rushing through because I know I'm taking time and I want to end this in a minute. Infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure, this is the picture we need to think about in the global south. It is not the picture of green buildings only. The problem of infrastructure is not having technology to green a building. The problem of infrastructure for the global south, but so many other places, is finding enough infrastructure for the people who need it. Now, if I'm right, the displacement is happening not from a disaster-prone climate area to Austria. It is happening from that village to the city in that same country. And that's the picture, and that's the infrastructure climate problem that you're talking about. Ecosystems. Again, I don't need to go into this. You've seen this on your headlines again and again, right? What does ecosystem loss mean? Ecosystem loss means livelihood loss. And when livelihood loss means, that means I look for somewhere else. And what I'm getting at with all of this is that climate migration is likely to be much more like economic migration than the type of migration that we see for, I'll come to refugees in a minute, for disasters only. That is also true. I'm not saying it's not so. I'm saying it's that plus what I'm talking about economic. Heat. Heat is a particular one. Heat is the one that hit us much earlier than most of us in the science thought. This is for major cities in Pakistan, but you can look at it elsewhere. And we think of heat and we think of, but even in this part of the world, But what does heat mean? You get a little more hot. Heat is about infrastructure. Whose life becomes more difficult, and what does really happen? What really happens is the images you are seeing in these pictures. This is from Karachi. There's no reason for 5,000 people to die in 2 weeks because the heat went up. What they die of is not just the heat, it is the lack of infrastructure, the previous one. And then you start thinking, okay, maybe I should be moving somewhere else, right? And sort of these mass graves and the morgues that come through it. And in some ways, I put those pictures, I apologize for that, because we need to sort of in some ways humanize and realize that heat is not just something on a thermometer. It is something that impacts people's lives. And then you have to sort of do graves. This is my last of the substantive slides, and then I have only one more, and I'll add refugees, right? I want to bring all of this together. We very often think about displacement as refugees, and when we think of refugees, whether you are in the US, where I am now, or whether you're in Europe, where many of you are now, this is the type of image that comes to mind. That may happen, but that is not likely. Because this happens when there is a single event and a lot of people have to rush. If my argument is right, it is much more going to be this, plus it is going to be much more economic migration, which means people start losing their livelihoods. When they lose their livelihoods, the smartest, the youngest, the most resourceful, the one with the best network leaves because they can. Who stays back? The oldest, the weakest, the most vulnerable, the least endowed. And that hollows society. We've seen that, for example, with the so-called Green Revolution. And that's a different type of migration. You are seeing this right now in Bangladesh in the Sundarbans, where all that has happened is a micromillimeter change in where seawater, saltwater, and freshwater meet. When that changes, the shrimp that grows there moves. When the shrimp moves, the Bangladesh farmers who capture the shrimp and live off it, their boats cannot go further into the sea. When their livelihood change is lost because the shrimp isn't there, they move from Sundarbans to Dhaka. They don't find jobs in Dhaka, they move from Dhaka to maybe Chittagong or to Delhi in India, and maybe from there to Vienna or Boston or whatever. But that's the nature of what we are talking about. The example I wanted, this is an old example, I hope you can see the colors, but it's an important one. This is what's called the Parrot's Beak region. In the bottom left is the country of Guinea, and that is surrounded by Sierra Leone. And on the bottom left, you see what's called the parrot beaks. It looks like a parrot beak. Note, actually my picture is filling it. Underneath my picture, it gives you the date, which is January 6, 1974. Okay? Keep an eye on January 6, 1974 and what happens to the screen right after that. I'm going to fast forward this picture. December 19, 1999. I'm trying to do the same sort of stuff now on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. What do you think happened here? Why did the colors change between 74 and 99? There was a war. Where was the war? The war was in Guinea. Was not in Guinea, it was in Sierra Leone. Why is the deforestation happening in Guinea? Because I don't like wars. When wars happen, I go somewhere else. So the refugees went from Sierra Leone to Guinea. What did they do? Because they have to live, more pressure on the natural resources. Right? You cut down trees. And that is the type of, I'm not saying that's the only thing, that's the type of things that happen. I've taken too much of your time. Last slide, what do we do? Let me give you a few headlines and I'll shut up after that. First, we need to move from thinking about managing refugees, which is what happens to you after a crisis turns you into a displaced person, to avoiding displacement. We need to focus our attention as governments, as agencies, as citizens, to avoid the catastrophe before it happens. On this one, we can, more than war, for example. Second, we need to move from maximizing security to minimizing insecurity. Right? I can go in the Q&A more into that, but that's a very different approach to foreign policy. It's a very different approach to international aid. And that's where sustainable development and adaptation comes. We need to move from thinking about adaptation as a problem to thinking about adaptation as a solution, because adaptation is a means to leapfrog, like the cell phones allowed us to do, so that countries don't follow the same path of energy, for example, that we have. Right? And so that's where the win-win could possibly be. And finally, we need to move from thinking about climate assistance to climate justice. This is a tough thing to say, but let me say it. I hope I'm amongst friends. Climate assistance is, I'm a nice guy, I will help you. Climate justice is, I might be a nice guy, but I messed up the planet. I owe it to those who are paying the price of my sins. And that's a different world, but I think it is a much, much better world. And that, to me, is what we should be talking about as we look at the future of climate and climate policy and climate adaptation and displacement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adil, for the wonderful visuals and for this time travel from what is usually expected from talks on climate. Instead of the future, we're talking about today, about the now and how this is happening now. We're going to hear also now from Raya Muttarak, and I think you're going to bring it also to the human level, to the differential vulnerabilities level, and you need the ticker, here you go. And I'm going to give you the floor now.
Thank you. Should I get the laptop as well? Maybe not. Oh, okay, then that's fine. I think it's fine, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniela, and also thank you, Adil, to already introduce us to the topic. So I just want to add up a bit to what you already covered. So I was asked to try to touch upon the gender dimension of climate-related migration, and I think the best way to enter into this discussion would be to look at it through the lens of differential vulnerability and differential adaptive capacity. Let me see, so I could click. So yeah, just bringing back to IPCC again. So if you want to understand the differential vulnerability, I guess it's quite useful to look at this conceptual framework of what are the components of risk, which is a function of three components, so hazard, exposure, and vulnerability itself. So imagine that if floods or storms happen in the remote area where no one lives, such as maybe in the desert, for instance. So no one is exposed to this risk. So then there's no risk because no one lives there. So people have to live in a certain place for risk to happen, right? So there has to be someone who gets exposed to it. So now maybe I just showing up the map of Vienna here. So we were already talking about heat, so I'm staying on the topic of heat. So on the small map there, right there, you may see that, so this is a big map. The bigger one is Lower Austria, and then that's a small, let me see if I can even point here. Possibly, yes. But that's, this is the first time I make a presentation live after COVID. I'm not used to this anymore. We don't use pointer anymore. Actually, it's always in Zoom halfway through. Anyway, so you see the small map in the 2019. The small one is Vienna. So what we are showing here is the number of heat days. So the redder the color is actually the higher the number of heat days. By the way, in the definition that we use here, this is commonly what we use in Austria. So the days where the degree is over 30 degrees, that would be counted as his heat wave, which wouldn't apply in India or Pakistan. That's, people laugh at me when I present this because it's completely different context, obviously. But yeah, over 30 degrees. So in the middle, one would see that we already captured the urban heat island. So Vienna as a city, it's much hotter, and it's getting hotter and hotter than the surrounding, than Upper Austria. The Lower Austria of the area. And then I'm just showing the map of, I guess most of you live here in Vienna, so we can see even inside the city of Vienna, so okay, people get exposed to heat, but then it varies actually by the district of Vienna that we are seeing here. So you would have like maybe the richer district, the district which are more green. So in these places, people would be less vulnerable because it's less concrete. So the green space, when heat wave happen, it's absorb much more the heat, the risk of heat. But then also the exposure also varies by what you do, right? Depends on your occupation. So probably if you work outdoor, then you're much more exposed. And then, so one could see that it varies already, even within the city of Vienna. And that's the type of work that we'll be looking at as well. What would be the future? What would be the future in terms of population structure? If the areas, a certain area, you would have older people or people with lower level of income and so on. So where should we invest in terms of health facilities? So that's the exposure. And then I already touched upon that. Then exposure varies by demographic characteristics, but also the vulnerability, which is the degree of susceptibility. For instance, if you're talking, stay on the topic of heat, for instance, different, even though you live in the same area of Vienna, but then heat is much more, or extreme temperature, it's much more dangerous for the very young, those who are aged under 5, or maybe the older population. So there's much more susceptible. So it varies by age, but also varies also by possibly your level of education and income, because people with higher income level probably can afford to live in the better housing and so on. So it's so this differential vulnerability would determine also that the ability to adjust to this climate risk. And also it varies not only at the individual level, but also, of course, it depends on the infrastructure of the community. I think you already touched upon the country and so on, health policy and so on. So moving to the sort of, coming now a bit to the gender dimension. So this is the context of South Africa. And I think this is quite it's not a nice story, but it is a nice example to show how, when we look at the households that are headed by women, compared with households that are headed by men, or dual household with 2 or more adults who are working, they already, as the baseline, they are different from each other in terms of, if you look at the median income level, for instance. So it's a graph on the left side. So the green bars represent household with 2 or more adults. So in general, this is regardless of climate change. When you have 2 adults working in the households, they already have higher income, and the male-headed household, which meaning the household where there's only men, tend to have high level of income, and female-headed households so can be widow, can be a divorced person or single mom, for instance. So in South Africa, it's quite higher rate. It's about in 2011, 41% of households are headed by women. So they already, as a baseline, they start with lower level income. So now the next question one could ask: so what about when they experience climatic shocks? What's going to happen to these households? So we pick up actually the triple burden that the female-headed household would face. So one thing, because women generally, and in the context of South Africa, and also I guess it's applied to Europe as well, so women tend to have lower level of income, have less access to resources, and so on. So that's the first burden. Household headed by women, being a woman itself, already started off being disadvantaged, so would have less capacity to cope with climatic shocks, with rainfall shocks, and so on. So the second burden would be something like, because the household is headed by women, so it's only one person who earn the income in the household. And female-headed households also tend to have more dependent members in the family, so tend to take care of children and then the elder population. So that's also the second burden. And the third burden is, so women also female-headed households tend to have to juggle between household duties and then earning income and so on. So it's sort of, it's a triple burden of being gender-related, but also in the household that's headed by women. So in South Africa, women also tend to have less access to resources, less likely to be to own a land, for instance. So So all of this combination make them more vulnerable, particularly when they experience shocks. Then I want to move a bit to differentiate also in terms of adaptive capacity. So I'm showing now the context of India. So what we are looking here is trying to look at when household experience things like rainfall anomalies, so the changes in the patterns of rainfall, what would happen to the nutrition of children? So what we are looking here is looking at the probability that the children becoming stunted, which means they are, particularly this applies to children aged under 5, so when they are too short for their age. So we know that the children of certain age, maybe the 4 years are supposed to be at that height, but they're not. So it's a good indicator of being undernourished. So what we are looking on the y-axis here is the probability of being stunted, and then on the x-axis is the amount of rainfall. So what you're seeing here on the x-axis is a 0 means it's normal rainfall condition, and +1 and 2 would be floods. Two wet conditions, and -1, -2 would be too dry conditions. So in the context of India, because it varies also in in sub-Saharan Africa, in the context of India, too much rain is not good for child nutrition. So too much rain would increase the probability of a child being too short for their age. But it varies. The people who live in the rural area are more susceptible to this. But what I like to point out, what is interesting here is actually when we want to look at, I cannot point. Actually, can I stand, if that's okay? Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, if I can just move, it's probably easier. So what is interesting here, when we are comparing between women with education of the mothers and also the level of wealth, as you may imagine, so if we are looking at the household where the mother is lower educated and poor, so the children of this group would have higher chance of being undernourished when experience too wet conditions. That's as what we would expect. The mirror image would be children from the rich household and mother is highly educated. They would have lower chance of being stunted compared to other group. But this is normal. This is what we would expect. What is interesting here is when we comparing the children whose mother is highly educated but poor, the chance of being stunted when experience a lot of rain is exactly the same as the children when the mother is rich but not educated. So here what we are picking up is when education actually, if you think about sustainable development goals and one needs to choose to invest in reducing poverty or maybe education, what we're picking up here is actually education can compensate the fact that the household may be poor, but the mother is educated. So they have some capacity to adapt. I work a lot on this impact of the impact of education on adaptive capacity, so I could talk more on that, but that's just an example I want to point out. Can I remain standing? Is that all right? Yeah. And actually, Adil already mentioned, actually, I think when we want to link it with mobility or immobility, because indeed this is the field that people start moving forward, because initially we tend to think of how climate change may affect migration, but obviously there are people who cannot move. So it is really useful to focus on the graph right here, that to think of, when we think of migration or non-migration, so people may aspire to move, may want to move, and people may not have ability to move. So it's always important to, when we think about climate driving migration, we have to think of, is it voluntary migration, people want to move, or it's involuntary? So particularly in the context of displacement, so people maybe, they don't want to move, but are forced to move, especially when we think of the rapid onset type of disasters, such as if you have earthquake or floods that one can't live in the place, so you're forced to move but maybe return. But then there are certain contexts, such as people may want to move, may want to use migration as an adaptation strategy, but may not be able to do so, particularly in the vulnerable subgroup of population who don't have resources. And And yeah, and you already mentioned, I just re-emphasize, because now it's been 10 years, and I think the evidence is now extremely consistent that it is the people in the middle income countries, or people who are in the middle income groups who would move if they experience some kind of climatic shock. So not the richest, and because the richest, they can also adapt, and not the poorest, because they're not able to move. So this is quite amazing, because now the evidence go consistently, both internal migration and international migration. This is my last slide, actually. So I haven't touched upon gender that much, because it is very complex, actually, when we want to understand the gender dimension of climate-related migration. So one of the first questions is that we have to ask, I think, is migration is an adaptation or not? Because I think it's useful to think of migration as a continuum. So sort of starting from, if migration is a reactive thing, so that you experience sudden floods and you have to move, so it's a sudden thing. So it's probably not an adaptation, you're kind of forced to move. But it can be adaptation when it's proactive. The household experienced droughts for many years, for instance. At some point, the household might decide that, okay, we're going to send someone in the family to work in the city. And I think this brings me to the second point, that when we think about gender and migration, but actually is migration an individual decision or household decision? Because typically people live in a household, right? So in a sense, not that would you send would a man move more or a woman move more? Maybe it's not the right question to ask, because we have to think of the context of the household. If household want to use migration as an adaptation strategy, may indeed choose to send out the younger one, the educated one, and if in the context that women make more money, may send women as opposed to men, and so on. So that I think that's also useful to think of migration not as only as an individual decision, but household decision. And finally, I just want to say that it's really hard to pin down if one wants to say, would women move more, or women more vulnerable, or men move more? There's no consistent evidence on that yet, and this is the field that we're moving forward and try to tackle this more. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Raya, and thank you also for your flexibility to stand up and use the resources we have here. You've touched on so many points on difference, on categories that are necessary to conduct the research that you do, but towards the end also pointed out to the fact of we might better think of a spectrum, of a continuum, because these categories don't always apply to the realities that we see when we research. And after the time travel that Adil took us through, you took us through a bit of a spatial, from our very own Vienna to other locations in the global south. And now we're going to hear from Jane Linekar. Do you have the clicker? Yes. And we'll hear more from you, I guess, particularly from your ongoing research, relying on examples from Africa. Yes? Yep. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me here. It's good to be here and part of this conversation. And what I'm really happy about is that everyone's already said that this is much more than just displacement. And that's what I really want to focus on right now. A little less on survival displacement as a form of human mobility, which gets a lot of headlines, is very dramatic and can be extremely damaging. But a little bit more on so-called voluntary migration, so people who are planning and preparing to move and not just fleeing in an emergency as an adaptation response to climate change before they reach that point of desperation, and also to look at immobility, which we've been talking about, people who can't move, people who don't want to move. And this is really important because, as has already been said, it's really critical to prepare responses that help prevent us getting to that point of survival displacement. We need to start talking about how people can thrive and adapt in place, or how we can facilitate safe movement and safe migration in the face of the impacts of climate change. To quote the recent White House report on climate change and migration policy responses to in the developed world will have a direct impact on political stability elsewhere. So we need to be thinking about it everywhere. And we mustn't wait until people cannot move to start thinking about what we're going to do about it. So our question is, what do people want to do? What are they doing and what can they do? So my normal day job is 4MI. And nice poetic, like I'm going to write a poem one day. 4MI is the Mixed Migration Centre's data collection system. So we conduct interviews with refugees and migrants on the move to ask them about their journeys and their experiences, their aspirations, but also why they left. And when we ask why they left, very few talk about environmental factors. As an example, we recently took one of our data sets. We asked people from Western Central Africa, and their response, in those responding environmental factors, 5% say environmental factors. But then if you ask them, were environmental factors involved in your decision to leave, it's 40%. So it's there, but it's a stress multiplier and it's complicated. People don't move for just one reason, and they also move because of livelihoods, or because of security, or because of health, and all of those livelihoods, security and health might have been triggered, at least in part, by climate-related events, environmental stressors, climate change. But that's only part of the story. These are the interviews with people who've crossed borders and are elsewhere. It doesn't include all of those people who move within a country and all those people who don't move. So what we're doing now is we've started a study as part of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, which was launched in September, where we're going to look at this individual and household, which is just what Raya was talking about, the decision-making at the individual and household level about movement in places that are being impacted by climate-related events. It's individual and household, it's kind of the local field research that's part of the project, because that's being complemented by a much larger quantitative modelling, where the team from Colombia is trying to look at the numbers of people who are going to be moving across Africa. And we want to complement that by talking about how people decide to make those moves. Because even if you're fleeing an emergency, there's still an element of decision-making there. It's not a complicated decision, but it's still there. And it's also, I wanted to say, it's a bit of a spectrum, this idea of forced displacement. And that comes across very clearly when we're talking about climate impacts and climate-related disasters. So let me move to some of the examples so we can put into perspective some of these concrete issues and questions that people are facing in some of the settings that we're looking at in our project. So we're looking at 7 hotspots in Africa, and we don't have the results yet, but I want us to look at the settings and the contexts and some of the questions that we're asking on the kind of mobility outcomes, as we call them, that we're looking at. So the first one, in North Africa, many places are predicted to be inundated along the coast due to sea level rise. Increasing sea temperatures are also going to impact on fish stocks, and there'll be salinization of agricultural land. So there's a lot going on, and some of it is pretty catastrophic, and some of it seems pretty inevitable. We've done some data collection and field research in Egypt, in Alexandria, a Delft city, and it's a small community just by the coast, who are primarily dependent on fishing, and the homes are regularly flooded. The question is, what are these people going to do? If they stay, are they going to be able to cope with regular flooding? Is there going to be some sort of pattern of displacement where they go and come back? What's the danger that people stay and try and cope, and rather than adapt, their coping mechanisms have become more and more negative until they're reduced to the point where it's a question of survival displacement? Or will people move before then, and what kind of form is that movement going to take? Is it going to be one of planned resettlement? Is there going to be a government policy to shift people out of these places and move them elsewhere? And what form will that take? And how do we know that it's viable and that it can succeed? Because some of this is happening in some places in the world already. Or will people choose to move under their own steam? Will they move, and where will they go, and who will go? We've already talked a little bit about the people that leave, and this will differ according to the context, livelihoods, and the kind of movement that they do. So what is important is that there will have to be responses, because these changes are going to happen, and there needs to be things that are done. People will need to respond. You'll need to work with the community to enable them to stay in place or to enable them to move, There's also a question of destination. If people move, we need to talk about host communities. If this is a fishing community, what on earth are they going to do if they have to move somewhere else? How are they going to change their livelihoods? None of this can be done without some sort of action on the part of institutions and other people. If I move to somewhere completely different, in the Sahel, we've been interviewing nomadic pastoralists. Now, these people have been moving because of climate for generations. So what's going to change for them? Because the climate is changing, their movement might change. There's also a lot of other pressures happening on this population. So again, we've got this question of a stress multiplier. We've got a lot going on in the Sahel. We've got a population that is growing. We've also got livestock population that is growing, so it needs more resources. We've got agriculturalists who are increasing the use of land as the populations grow in these countries. There's more sharing that has to happen of resources, and there's more pressure on resources, as well as unpredictable climate events. So there's going to be disrupted mobility patterns. Something is going to happen, and it's important to know what. Are people going to, possibly they'll even stop moving, or they'll move elsewhere, or different people will be moving, and there needs to be a response to this. If I move back to a city, because we have a lot of delta cities and it's coastal cities, and urbanization is a huge issue, which has already been talked about. We've done some data collection in Lagos, so an urban delta environment, which is common. There's many of these environments elsewhere. And what's important to note here is that these are informal settlements. And as has been said before, the people who are being hit worst by climate-related events are the most vulnerable. It's people who are setting up. Now, these are mobility hotspots. They're normally places where people arrive. And quite often, these might be people who've arrived because they've been affected by climate-related events elsewhere. So it's just like a storm of events happening and going on. So you've got this population. Many of them might be new arrivals. And it's normally considered an informal settlement. It's a place you arrive in, you make your money, you move on, you move out and elsewhere. This settlement in Lagos is frequently hit by flooding. And what does that mean for mobility? Does that mean people leave more? Does that mean people don't have the means to leave because you need to save up money to be able to move on and get out? What are the impacts on them, and how much do people want to move? And then my slightly overexposed final slide is a sedentary population in a kind of semi-rural area. We did data collection in southern Angola in the outskirts of a small town. And what we did is we mainly interviewed people who were not directly dependent on climate for their livelihoods. So these weren't people who are primarily dependent on agriculture or on livestock. And what is interesting to find out about here is what the impacts of climate change mean for them. If they're living in a town and they have their salary, what's going on for them? The dryness and the drought is leading to rising food prices, rising water costs, reduced availability of water. There are also health impacts. Does this mean people want to move, or do they want to do something else? Are they going to move? Who's moving? And this is in the context of a camp where people have already moved. There is forced displacement because of the drought. People came here in search of food assistance. What's going to happen to them? What next? Can they go back? And if they don't go back, what can we do? So the point I kind of want to end on is that climate and change and human mobility are linked, inextricably linked in some ways. But what we need to do is understand the realities of different communities and the nuance and the context and all the intervening stuff, the stress multipliers. It's not very straightforward, and people might respond in different ways. Men might leave because they need to go and make a living. Men might stay because they need to make a living. Age, gender, there's so many different things going on. But what we need to do is listen, respond effectively so we can help this prevent this survival displacement from happening. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. You mentioned so many other points as well, and some of these are well established for those migration scholars in the room, right? The multi-causality of migration. People don't move because of one reason. And I'm so grateful for the wide number of questions you pose. You're conducting your research. You don't have results. We had a lot of science and results and graphs before that. But I think these many questions that you asked, will people move? Do people want to move? Do people want to stay? And will they be able to? Are very important questions to ask. And I invite the audience to think about them for your questions later on. And finally, we started framing this talk in the margins of COP26, thinking of international and global movements, approaches. As we know, this topic has been discussed and perhaps more prominently in global and international fora, trying to speak of what international frameworks, policy frameworks, categories for people do we need at a world level. And Jane brought it down to the ground, reminding us that realities on the ground are different. Contexts are different. Members of households face different realities, opportunities, limitations. So what I would like to move on now to our discussion section is building on 3 key points that I heard across your presentations. One was climate justice. How do we get there? How do we make it a topic of conversation? Agency, I think that was very prominent in your talk, Raya, as well. And intersectionality, this differential vulnerabilities. Will men move in a way, women in a different way? What kind of institutions do we need to support that? What kind of movements or non-movements are going to happen when we're not talking only about migrant, there isn't a climate migrant, a prototype that applies across the entire world, right? So what I would like to do now is have a discussion among the panelists. So perhaps you can respond to these questions and to the presentations of the previous panelists, perhaps 5 minutes each, so that we have also time to invite questions from the audience in person and the audience following us through Facebook. Does that sound okay? Yes? Okay, so perhaps we could start with Raya. Is that okay?
Okay, the mic is on. So maybe I won't really pick up on all the points you were raising, but Jen raised one thing that I think we haven't done much actually in our work, as in I'm not only talking about my work, but also the field of climate-related migration, particularly those who look at the quantitative side, is the destination. So the field has exploded in the past 10 years. As I was saying, that the evidence now becoming a bit more consistent, but still people tend to look at most of all of these climatic effects can be temperature change or rainfall change affect migration or not, because in the past 10 to 15 years, it wasn't consistent. As we always find, sometimes people move, sometimes people don't, in certain contexts and so on. And now it has moved to the level that, okay, we kind of being able to pick up if the move is going to happen, it's tend to be short distance. It's unlikely to be that would be mass migration, that people would come from maybe Africa coming to Europe due to climate change. That's more unlikely. And also, of course, we were talking already about the middle income and so on. But still, we don't know much actually about the destination. Like, where do people go? Because we tend to look at the origin. So I think that's a really important thing, because in fact we know that people, if it's an internal migration, people tend to move into the city and what kind of infrastructure, and are they even more vulnerable, particularly in places like in Asia and I guess in Africa as well, because you may move to the city and then probably cannot afford very good housing, or maybe tend to settle down anyway in the area with poor environmental conditions, maybe even becoming more vulnerable. So conceptually, we think about, but we don't look at that. And I guess that's to move the field forward. That's another thing to look at. And another point that was raised is the heterogeneity, so the differences, and still as again, the few tend to look at who move, or maybe how many people does increase in 1 degree of temperature, would it affect migration? Or, but typically, we don't know yet so much because of the data as well. Like, are people with high level of education move more, or maybe women or men at different age? So there's no data. And heterogeneity is important and to look at. And I think another thing is the field goes back and forth. I think generally in the beginning. So I'm one of these people who try to synthesize, because I think one of the questions that the media tend to ask, it's like, does climate change affect migration or not? Would Europe be the destination country for African migrants or not? So that's what people tend to ask. Yeah, I forgot my point now. What I wanted to say, it's I think I forgot what I wanted to say. What the media?
Trying to read your mind, Raya, but
Yeah, because the media tend to ask you, and yeah, I forgot. I may come back to that. Oh yeah, heterogeneity. Sorry. So we tend to want to produce such number, right? But at the end, actually, the more we look at it, it has to vary by the context, by the countries, and by the even rural urban area and so on. So at the end, trying to synthesize, getting one number doesn't really make sense. Actually, heterogeneity is really important, I think.
thank you.
Yeah, sorry,
Thank you so much, Raya. No, that's a very important. In fact, that is a question that we're not asking today, right? I think that was one of the key points of Adil's presentation. We're not asking the question, does climate change affect or impact migration? It's happening, we're in the now, and how do we manage it? How do we go about it? Whose voices do we need to hear? And so on. Could we hear from you now, Jane?
Yeah. A couple of points. So as we've been saying, movement requires resources. People need stuff to be able to move, and I think this is one of the key questions. What do people need? If they want to move, what do they need? And how can they move safely? Because the risk that we have is that people don't move, and that because they don't have the resources, and then they have even fewer resources, and we end up in a really bad situation. So what do people need? They need information. They need information about journeys, information about destinations, information about livelihoods. They need access to livelihoods. They need money. They need networks. They need to know that, feel some confidence about where they're going to go, and that they're going to be able to build a life for themselves. That's important about people who want to move and do move. For those who don't want to stay, what do they need to be able to stay? And this is this is not migration as adaptation, this is other forms of adaptation, but what do they need to be able to stay? And this is, people don't want to, there's not a huge amount of dependence on aid. I don't think people are waiting for someone to help them out. It's just that we need to be clear on what is needed and how we can promote that adaptation and listen to what people want. The intersectionality is really important. From what we've seen, the hotspots we chose were places there we could see that people were being impacted by climate-related events, and people who are being impacted by climate-related events, they're really vulnerable already. There's very low indicators for things like education and income and all sorts of things going on. And then those who are hit hardest are those who are most vulnerable. So yeah, it becomes this big storm. And this is something that has to be addressed, because then we come back to justice. and it's really not fair. And it has to be that, this is my bad, we have to do something about this, but we don't do it in this top-down way, which I don't think is going to help anybody. Even if we manage to do that, at the moment, I'm not holding out much hope.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you for that optimism. If I can jump in and thank you. Not as much a response as reflections based on sort of the wonderful ideas that have been shared. I'll pick up your 3 points, Daniela: climate justice, agency, and intersectionality, and thoughts that came from Jane and Raya. I hope I'm not too harsh, but In some ways, my colleagues are far more careful than I am. Just because I've been at this maybe too long and I've seen too many things fail, so I'm leaving the care out. In some ways, I think this is the agency question. I think we also need to be, maybe it's intersectionality also, not dissect the immediate causality too much because of what both of them are saying, and I think I'm saying. It doesn't work like that. It isn't like some people come because of climate, and some come because of economics, and some come because of Taliban. That's not how it happens. People don't choose, people don't sit and say, I'm going to make a choice about moving or not. If you are being, displacement is an act of desperation. I made a choice when I came to the US to study. That wasn't displacement. That was economic advancement. But the displacement we are talking about is an act of desperation, which means insecurity forces people to make decisions that they would not make otherwise. And those insecurities, as I think all three of us are saying, do not come in neat packages. I would bet, irrespective of what people say, that many migrants that you see around Europe or the US or in Asia are climatically displaced. If you ask them, did you move because COP23 didn't come up with an agreement? That's not what they're going to say, right? But what they are going to say is, I lost my job. Now it is my job as a researcher to say, okay, why did you lose your job? Because it was the 5th year of a drought, right? Even with things like war, people don't really move because of a war. They move because the war creates conditions that make me insecure. They don't move just because of ideology. Yes, they move because of ideology too. They move because ideology creates conditions that make my survival difficult, right? And that's the point about this that is very, very important. Now, why am I still a hopeful person? Because in some ways with climate, we have an opportunity. That Bangladesh example I gave, if I tell you micromillimeter sea level change between salt water and fresh water, you say, hey, what's the big deal, right? I say the big deal is the shrimp moves. You say, what's the big deal? I say the big deal is that the Bangladeshi farmer now can't get to the shrimp. Now you understand what the big deal is, because this guy cannot make his livelihood. Here is the good part of the story. What does it take to solve the problem? A better boat and a nylon net, right? And that, a better boat and a nylon net could be, I'm speculating, the difference between migrating and not migrating for economic reasons. Now that's the policymaker's question. Can you invest in a nylon net and a better boat before that migration happens, or are you going to wait for it to blow up as a political issue in the next election, when you're going to spend much more money because you thought, well, nylon nets are not really about migration, and this comes from my migration budget, right? That's the problem that my climate friends are also making. I think a lot of my climate friends, I speak myself, are making the mistake. They're saying, well, prove to me that this migration is because of climate. And I say, bunkum, I'm not going to prove that. I don't have that much time to waste on you. No migration is ever because of one reason, right? But is climate in the mix? You're 40%. Right? That's the question. Now that means we researchers have to be bold. Very, very quickly on the other two, or on the other one, intersectionality. You know, I often say to my students in earthquakes aren't about climate, but it's a good example. No one ever dies in an earthquake, or because of an earthquake. Nearly no one ever has died because of an earthquake. People don't die because the earth shakes. People die because the roof falls. And why does the roof fall? Because one guy has a strong roof and the other doesn't. So who dies? The one who doesn't have a good roof. Right? The same is true for a lot of other displacements. The point that I think you made, the middle one, right? If I'm rich, I have a strong roof. I will adapt. If I'm poor, I didn't have a roof in the first place. And therefore, again, this is the point I was saying. Just like climate people have to change, I think migration people also have to change and start thinking about what happens to the people who stays. Why do they stay? What do they do when they stay? One of the most critical questions, I think, Jane, you put it was, what does the person who stays do? Right? Do they leapfrog to a more sustainable way of doing things? Or do they actually, are they forced to do even less sustainable? And that's the policy question. Can my policy intervention be such that those who stay can leapfrog to a better thing? So those are my sort of three thoughts on this. But I think this especially this thing about, I think you called it intersectionality, that we need to have the boldness not to put labels on displacement as this or that, because in the real policy world, budgets come with labels. And that's what we are running after. Certainly, I know my climate people, I'm very critical of them, because they want to say, well, but can you really prove this one is because of that? No, I can't. Just like I can't prove to you that what part of the heat wave was because of climate change, and what part of the heat wave was because summers are hot. What I can prove to you, empirically, is that the amplitude changed, that the heat waves are more strong, and they are more frequent. Even if I can't tell you which part is which. And that, I think, ought to be the policy discussion on climate and displacement.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Adil. Indeed, once again, this multi-causality, we cannot prove that people move or do not move for a single reason. And I take your invitation for migration scholars and for climate studies to think differently. I think one of the challenges, and perhaps some of your questions can come in that direction, is, Adil, you pointed to this is the question for policymakers. Policymakers are often working in silos, right? There's migration policy, sustainability policy, climate change adaptation policy. How do we get all of these different policymakers to have this more holistic and wide take on the issue? That would be a question for another event, Michael, with more time. But perhaps some of you who are joining the workshop tomorrow to tackle policy issues can have some time to exchange on that front. If you allow me, I think I would like now to open it up for the audience. Is that all right? Yes? Okay. So if there are any questions from the audience in person, just raise your hand and our colleague Nadia will bring a mic to you. I know we're all shy, slowly going back to in-person activities. There is no button to raise your hand. You really have to raise your hand. All right, maybe we can check in. Oh, okay, we have a hand on the left side. Yes. If you wish, you can tell us your name and your affiliation, and perhaps if you don't mind standing up, it's a bit difficult to see you.
Okay. I didn't expect this.
Sorry.
Hi, I have a question for Mr. Najam. My name is Nicole Lobianco. I don't have any affiliation, it's just interest that I'm here today. And my question is, and I hope it's not too personal, but how do you deal with seeing all those impacts on the country that you come from and living in the United States, where climate change is, I don't think, as much of a topic when it comes to individual people as it is here?
Thank you for that question. Would you like to take that, Adil?
No.
Moving on.
Sure. Sure, I'm happy. Do you want to take a few more if there are? And I can take that. I can take that. These are personal choices, but they're also institutional and life choices that just happen. First of all, a lot of my work personally is in Pakistan. And therefore, sort of, I hope I can contribute to the conversation there sometimes better by being outside. But more importantly than that, I think it is in America that my message is more important. Right? The Pakistanis know what is happening to them. My job is to get in front of an American class every day and try to create a generation trying to understand and think about this. And that is where, but more importantly, I think it's that globalness, right? I often use this example, and I think this is a serious response to your question. In some ways, these little lines that we draw on paper thinking they are real, aren't real. I crossed 2 days ago the border between Germany and Austria. It's not there. It really isn't. You can go and you can look at the ground. The color doesn't change. There isn't actually a line. There's just a guy there who says this is where it changes. So these little squiggles that we have made, and then we sort of nationalize them, the climate and environment does not respect them. I live in the United States right now. I'm a Pakistani citizen. If I go from US to Canada, at the border, I have to show my Pakistani passport. And then they let me go through. But the pollution from my car doesn't. The carbon molecule from my car doesn't have a flag on it. Right? And that's the climate justice point. The point is that for the Bangladeshi farmer or shrimp grower, that's not because of Bangladeshi emissions. Right? Part of the challenge of climate is, and the reason I think it has to be global. In fact, I understand the local point entirely, but I think it is a very dangerous point because it makes us think as if local problems have local solutions, but they are also caused by local things. The point is that carbon molecule is moving around, right? And that's the climate justice point that, for example, Glasgow is not addressing. The climate justice point is my emissions, to your question, my emissions in Boston are far greater than my brother's emissions in Islamabad. Right? That's the climate justice problem.
Thank you, Adil. Do we have any more questions from the audience here in person? Yes, we have one question here in the front, Nadia. Thank you. I can see you. We can. You don't have anybody in front. You have an advantage.
Okay. I don't know who this is for, the question. So I'm working on my master thesis with regards to climate migration and considering new migration movements as rather as alternative migration movements, rather than seeing them as So I'm just wondering if there are any suggestions on how to cope with possibly new migration movements which span across transnational borders, because that's my focus. So basically, what are your opinion on circular migration facilitation or adaptation methods which include transnational cooperation or international cooperation? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's something we didn't have time to touch on. And also the temporary aspect of some kinds of migration. We know that from disaster research, often people move for a while until the flood has retreated, until temporary shelters or more permanent shelters have been established. And this issue has been addressed by some regions more than others. Would somebody who would like to take this? Perhaps Raya or Jane?
Start, where are you doing your master degree? Because I have a colleague at University of Vienna who's actually touching upon this topic of sort of, it's much harder to look in terms of, you use the survey of data, but you may have to go down to interview like the translocality, because people actually indeed move back and forth and keep the ties, right, with their families. And I think that would be the type of approach, it's called translocality, to tackle this sort of circular migration and that kind of thing, yeah. Yeah, exactly. You probably are working with Patrick Saknapurak, who's actually, yeah, and that's his, he has this approach, and I think you're already with the best. Yeah.
Anything to add on that front?
It's not working.
Oh, there it is.
There you go. Just that this is, this speaks a little bit to what we were talking about with the pastoralist community that have been doing this for generations, where there is no line and there are communities across borders, but it's also happening elsewhere, and it's displacement and it's seasonal migration because they need to diversify their livelihoods. But it is happening, and these borders don't mean much, and I think it has to be facilitated, and perhaps there needs to be better protection mechanisms, and I think this is going to be something that's a lot to do with not just our research projects for the initiative, but it's going to be a broader consideration, because it is that these borders are porous. It makes sense for a lot of the time for these people to move, and I think that if this is a way of adaptation, it should be facilitated.
Thank you. Yeah, an interesting region is the Pacific, and how relations with New Zealand and Australia with small island states are tackling that. And we know small island states were at the forefront of making this issue public, and advocacy and campaigns, etc. So that might be an interesting region to look at. Do we have more questions here in the room? Do we have questions from Facebook? Yes? Could we have the one question from Facebook? Oh, okay.
So from Facebook, these came in from Marie. So for Jane, do you have an example of activities that could empower local communities and positive outcomes of these? For Adil, in the margin of COP, you mentioned moving from climate assistance to climate justice. What ways do you suggest to achieve this? Better understanding of the climate crisis and responsibilities within the crisis. And then to all speakers, this may not be your direct expertise, but rather based on your experience and understanding. How do you think political tensions linked to the climate crisis, as they might also be a reason for displacement?
Thank you, Monica, for bringing in participants from wherever they may be joining us. Is anybody ready to take questions first? I think there was one for Adil, right? Would you like to go?
Sure. Can I take Jane's question? Jane can take mine.
I was going to use your answer.
So on the local action, right? So and this has been sort of a constant theme, and I know I sometimes get into trouble about this. I think the local action, I want to give an example, but I also think that turning local as the opposite of global is a mistake. It is conceptually a mistake, and it is practically a mistake. I understand local is local and global is global, but in the debate when we separate them, we don't have the ability to link them together the way the dots are linked. And therefore, I think global should go with local. But on the local, the example I gave of Bangladesh, it takes a better boat and a nylon net, which is much cheaper, for example. This is what Jane was saying. You have to understand those local contexts. It's going to take something else somewhere. But what that means in real practice is what we call sustainable development. Essentially what it takes is creating more sustainable livelihoods to enhance or replace the unsustainable livelihoods that are likely to be impacted by climate change. Right? That's the solution. Now it looks very neat, it's very difficult, because if you are the Ministry of Migration or you are the Ministry of Foreign Affairs working on migration, it's very difficult to convince you to get people nylon nets, because it only becomes your problem when the migrant is here. And the same problem if you're the Ministry of Climate Change. It's very difficult to convince them that start working on making people's lives better before they become migrants, because they say, oh, but that has got nothing to do with climate. That's got nothing to do with carbon. And that's why sort of this integrated idea of development as interlinked is important. So that's my little contribution to that. And the local examples are so many and are so good. I can give you one more. For example, we did research when by the way, I'd moved back to Pakistan and done much research there, and this was part of it, where we tried to determine what the impact on agriculture in Pakistan would be for wheat and rice with current trend of global climate change. And by 2050, we estimated a net loss of 16% productivity. 16% productivity on a country that depends on agriculture is huge. Here is what's interesting. We then did the same analysis with the most minimal of sustainable agricultural practices. In which case, by 2050, there is a net increase of 7%, which means the loss plus, right? And so what that means is, because things are bad sometimes, you have an opportunity to leapfrog, and that's where the local comes in on your question. On the climate justice is a difficult thing. In some ways, we've also made climate justice very local. I'm sorry, but it has to be also at the global point. Climate justice simply is very simple. I took those slides off from mine, but they're in the pack if you want. Climate justice is, there are some of us, me, whose impact on the global climate is much, much more than of those who are the most vulnerable, for the same reason that the roof falls on the poor. And we do not have tools, and we do not have the willingness to base it on that justice thing. It's like I take my car and ram it into your home. That's what the climate justice problem is. I owe you to do something about your home. Now, this is not about finger pointing, but this is about looking at international aid and assistance from a different way. It is about, and it's not even about good guys, bad guys. It is about looking at the international aid not as there are some good people and there are some poor people, and the good people will send money to the poor people, right? Which is how we look at it. Instead, what I think climate justice would take is not that there are good people and bad people, but there are all people who live on a planet that don't have those squiggles. And much like COVID, either all of them are better off, or none of them will be. Right? That's the global citizenship approach. I know it sounds poetic, like you're for me, but I think that's the solution.
There were other questions directed to Jane and Raya, I believe, too.
I could take the political tension one, yeah.
Okay, do you want to get started with that one?
Oh, maybe
Or Jane?
linking with Adil, maybe Jen can
Okay.
So yeah, the local global, they're part of the same thing. I mean, and this is what, when reviewing a lot of the research and the findings that we have on this link between climate change and migration is that it is very local, because in some respects it has to be, because there are local contexts. Everything is specific to the culture and the livelihoods and so many things about where a person is. But the point is, this is on a global scale, and people are being affected, a lot of people being affected very badly, but the settings are all very different, and I think we need to take both of those things into account and hold them both in our head at the same time. In terms of, yeah, I don't think I got a better example than your nice boat and your net in terms of positive outcomes. It's diversifying livelihoods, people who use perhaps different crops and learn things. I think one of the things of migration as adaptation, it can be long-term permanent migration or seasonal migration. It can also be migration, learning new skills and return, which is something that is studied a lot in the migration community, but this is also something that can help in terms of adaptation to climate change. And I think I will stop there and pass over to Raya.
I'd like to take the question on, I think, on political tension and the link with the climate crisis and migration. This is yet another extremely hot topic, by the way. Does climate change cause conflict or not? And maybe I can take you back to the 2015 when Central Europe, well, most of us live in Austria, so we experienced the mass migration of people coming through the Central European and then to Austria, and then Germany took in 1 million refugees. So if you go back and look at the headline news in major media, can be The Guardian, New York Times, and so on. So many media actually try to link this event, like the mass migration out of Syria. It's linked to because of conflict caused by climate change. So now what we did is it true or not? So we took the data, the global data on the UNHCR data that look at the asylum-seeking applications and refugee flows, look at the climate data of the happened some years before, because the media tend to say that because there was drought in Syria, and then it was a drought that caused conflict because of mismanagement of water management and resources. People move in the urban area, that caused conflict, because tension between scarce resources, and then that caused migration. So we actually did find the effects. We can make the model we use can make the causal link actually that so indeed in the Western Asia did experience some kind of a lower water, so drought condition, and that lead to conflict outbreak and then migration. But this is very specific. It is a combination of the perfect storm in a sense, because of course there were drought also happening in other areas of the world as well in different time period and so on. So what I wanted to say, it may affect, so climate condition may affect conflict and it may affect migration, but only in certain contexts. In fact, imagine it unlikely to happen in Austria, right? Because of probably with better level of governance, so perhaps the management of scarce resources is better. So it's just a combination of, back then in Western Asia, the Arab Spring period in the country where people also have a bit more of autonomy to make a protest and movement, because it's unlikely, if the regime is too autocratic, such as North Korea, it wouldn't happen either, the outbreak of conflict. So it's sort of, yeah, we did find some evidence, but we're very cautious in the sense that to make such a link, such a claim, need to understand the context and different drivers. And I think it goes back to what we were saying, that it's too simplistic to say that drought happened, temperature increased, then it linked to migration or conflict, because we need to take as much as we can the factors that we can account for to understand the complexity of the relationship. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raya. Last chance for questions from the room. Okay, we have one here, Nadia, on the right side.
Hello, my name is Claudia Thalmeier. I work for WIDE, which is a women's network of working in the area of development cooperation. And we follow the discourse about migration and climate for some time. And for me, what was striking, somehow, we are discussing all this in a country which is extremely restrictive with migration, using nationalist politics, painting horror scenarios of migration, of mass migration. And we are always stuck in a discourse, on the one hand, painting very drastic pictures or drastic realities, which we have today also seen somehow upcoming. And on the other hand, how to avoid such a discourse of victimizing people and of allowing nationalist discourses. And Austria, just to say, in terms of refugee politics and migration politics, has not even, I mean, we did not take a single refugee from Greece. We did not sign the Global Compact. Would you have any policy advice for a country like Austria?
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that question, because if you hadn't said it, I would have brought one of the elephants that we have in the room, and that is also the anti-immigrant sentiment in politics, the context that we're living in and how it's increasing, not only in Austria. So perhaps I can take this question to invite our speakers today to make a closing statement if you have policy advice. Thinking out of your shoes and out of taking off your researcher hats, we've heard a lot of science, data, projects, results, projects in the making. What voices do you think are missing from this discussion today? What voices would you like to hear that inform the policy? Because we know that policymakers do read some academic publications, not all. Let's say the science has some venues to reach policymakers. So my invitation to you is try to address Claudia's question, thinking from outside academia. What other voices are not represented today in this podium that are important for policymakers to consider? Who would like to start? Tough one. Who would like to remove their researcher hat for the very last couple minutes? Sure? Thank you, Adil.
Sure. I mean, in a way, I'd like to address both your question and what the lady asked, what voices are missing? I would like to see more development voices, right, from whatever way. And I make a distinction here. There was a reason why I started by saying I came to this from development. I've worked all my life on climate, but I don't think I see myself as a climate person. I see myself as a development person, and that's unfortunate. So in some ways, I think we need more development voices in climate, and we need more development voices in migration. Because, and this goes to your very excellent point, but development is cheaper. Development policy is cheaper than climate policy. Development policy is cheaper than immigration policy. Most importantly, development policy is better than both. That takes a lot of effort, right? Because if you're for or against, it's a good political issue, and that's why it becomes political issues. And it doesn't help either the migrant or the person who doesn't come here. Because again, we go back to, others have also said, for me, especially in climate, but even other things, you know, when we turn this into simply immigration policy or refugee policy, our focus is on the refugee who makes it or tries to make it, right? But what about the ones who doesn't? Who very often is as vulnerable or more vulnerable. And that is going to be more and more true for climate. So in some ways, I would want to see a world where there is less immigration, but not because people build higher walls, but because they build better bridges and create the conditions so that immigration doesn't happen. I know it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's both cheaper and better, right? And that is where adaptation, and this is why I talk about the age of adaptation. Show me an adaptation policy, and I will show you a policy that will have at least two characteristics. A, it will be local. Adaptation cannot be done globally. Mitigation can be done globally, right? So it will be by definition local and will be by definition about development. Show me any adaptation policy that's truly adaptation, and it will be a development policy. It will create better conditions for people. And that's the same recipe, I think, to also deal with immigration partly. So I think we need better immigration policy. I think we need a more global attitude to a lot of problems. But I would like to see more development infused in both of these worlds that I care deeply about.
Thank you very much, Adil. So more development voices. Who would like to go on?
So I can go. So taking myself out of my comfort zone, let's put it that way, which is the area that I'm not an expertise, but I noticed. So one thing is, well, if I would put it as communication, right? So how do we communicate all of these messages? And of course, I tend to cite the media and so on. But what I wanted to say is, so we have a lot of evidence. We are aware. People in this room are the self-selected one. You already know or believe that climate change is happening. You already know that it affects people, which is fine. This is good. That's why you are here. But what about the rest of the population? That goes back to the climate justice. How do we sell this? And I need to quote my work because it's always, I need evidence-based, otherwise I can't think logically. So one of our recent work is to look at the voting for Green parties. And we look at the European Parliament data in the past 30 years. And what is shown clearly is actually the area in Europe that experienced some kind of changes in climatic conditions. And we observe actually the surge in Green Party voting as well. But this is not the point, right? So we were saying in our conclusion, what's the policy communication? It's not that people should experience climate change first, then being aware, and then vote for Green Party, then want to make a change. So this is not the point. But how do we make people bypass this experience? So you can already be aware of it without needing to experience such a bad thing first. And as I said, it's not my strong point, but it's something to think about, because we tend to write better communication, but that's not enough, because you cannot just put the picture, speak in the media, and that's enough to stimulate people to make an action. And I don't have an answer for that, but that's the area to think about. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raya. So communication, more communication voices, or
But how?
But how, exactly, because how often do you talk to journalists and they'll flip what you said into alarmist headlines? Jane, how about you? Where is your, out of your comfort zone?
Totally out of my comfort zone. No, but there's so much evidence out there, and there are a lot of voices already speaking out there, and I think a lot of people have heard those voices and they still have their conclusions, and they still want to talk about the discourse is still very, very extremist about particularly the migration issue in Europe. What I think is interesting is a completely different perspective. It is, yes, you shouldn't have to experience climate change and be displaced for yourself to understand that this is an impact and it's real, and to have a bit of empathy and understand that you might want to do something elsewhere if it's not hurting you right now. But I do wonder, and I am curious about what the impacts of some of the events of last year in the more developed countries has had. I'm not sure that COP26 is showing us a great deal, but in terms of voters and people's perspectives on these things. So these perspectives and voices will be interesting to see if they're shifting at all. The other thing is a story which isn't related to climate change, but it just shows a completely different perspective and voice on migration. When someone from Europe was asking us about the crisis and all of the arrivals into Europe from Africa, if you asked someone, you know, some policymaker in, say, Nigeria, I don't know, in one of these countries, what? That's not where the migration is. This isn't the, migration mostly stays within a country, mostly stays within a region. It is a tiny fraction of a population that leaves to head to Europe, and an even tinier one that gets to Europe. So you have a European who will talk to someone and go, this huge crisis we have in Europe of people coming from your region. And we're like, who? This is a tiny number. If I want to talk about migration policy in my country, it's not going to be about this tiny, tiny number of people. So it's this very different perspective that I think would be nice if that was appreciated a bit more in Europe.
Thank you very much, Jane. So policymakers from outside Europe or the global north, perhaps? Adil, I see you.
I know I misbehaved a lot, so I apologize. But if I can take once again, just triggered by what both of my colleagues said, and maybe try to end, I don't know if it's a positive note or not. So maybe the experience, especially on climate, less on migration, but on climate, but also on migration, maybe the experience of COVID is something we also need to think seriously about. Right? So we went through what I imagine is in everyone in this room and Facebook's life, the single most global crisis of our lifetime. Right? The single most and the most truly global crisis, immediate crisis of our lifetime. The bad news, there was no global response. The last time you saw WHO was when they came and said, this is a global pandemic. After that, what's the first thing we did? Close the border, put a mask, don't let anyone else. Don't send your mask to Italy if you're Germany, right? We later came to something else, I'll come to that. So maybe that's one lesson I don't know. And that's the troubling lesson. On the other side, here is what happened, which is very amazing. History will record that we did science at a level that even our most optimistic scientists did not think we could do. Right? In a matter of months, we had a vaccine, which nearly to 100% or very high degree works. I could not have imagined that in the beginning, right? And so what that means is we have the knowledge. There's no doubt this is the most knowledgeable time in human history. And more interestingly, the money came like this. The 100 billion that used to be so difficult, when people believed that they were actually threatened, when people believed that the existential threat was personal, we found the money in no time at all, $1 trillion. And we spent it like that, and it didn't change much. So we have the wisdom, we have the knowledge, we have the money, more than any time other in human history. The challenge is whether we as a species have the wisdom or not to think and act like a species. I think that's the ecological challenge, much greater than even climate. That we have the money, we have the knowledge, do we have the wisdom to think and act like a species for our own survival? I hope we do, but I'm not fully sure.
Thank you so much, Adil. If some of you have seen UNDP's campaign this year for COP is a dinosaur telling us, well, if you're not listening to people, to the science, listen to a dinosaur. We know a thing or two about extinction. Well, don't choose extinction is the name of the campaign. With that, I think I'm going to close tonight's event, thanking all of the wonderful speakers today. This topic isn't going away anytime soon, so if you want to continue conversations, you can find their contacts on the web. And I want to thank the VIDC team. Thank you, everybody. In the front rows, behind the scenes, the interpreters, thank you very much. Thanking the audience here in person and everybody who joined us through Facebook. May you have a lovely evening, morning, wherever you're tuning in from. So those of you here, have a good evening. Don't forget to fill in the feedback forms. VIDC really appreciates and builds on that feedback to plan their events. Thank you very much.